Following is an account of my experiences in World War I, which was written in September in 1919, shortly after my return from Germany. Introduction. The following pages are too incomplete to be called an autobiography, and the events set forth too fresh in my mind to be called memoirs. They contain none of the elements of fiction or the methods of history. They are written simply for those, present and future, whose interest in the author is keen enough to desire to know his experiences and his impressions of the World War. Now, I would make them a sermon only so far as the truths they reveal may preach the gospel of America, that is, to place itself in the foremost rank of those who fight for liberty, humanity, and justice, to take its rightful place as a great moral force in the world, and act with unselfish devotion to the cause of humanity against the distorted passions of peoples and the unscrupulous ambition of kings. Preliminary steps. The war came upon us like a storm at sea. For 2 years and a half we had watched the raging in the east, catching at times the glare of the lightning and the rumble of the thunder. It seemed far away, and we felt secure. Some mariners, however, saw the clouds rolling heavily towards us and warned us of the danger. We watched and waited, telling ourselves it would pass by, and only looking at the sun overhead. Only a few who respected the words of the mariners took heed and raised futile voices in warning to prepare. The sinking of the Lusitania was the first stroke of lightning, and it struck hard and at home. The clouds rushed over us. On April 7, 1917, the storm broke, and then we sought cover to awake to the situation that we were not ready. Early in April, there was formed Volunteer Officers Training Group, which met daily at Governor's Island for a brief hour's drill after the business day. This was supplemented by a college man's training class, which met in the evening at the 19th Coast Artillery Armory, Manhattan. I attended both, for my knowledge of military drill or tactics was nil. This training was of short duration, and I learned only the rudest fundamentals, such as the number of men in a squad and how the latter differed from a platoon. The call soon came for applicants to the officers' training camp to be held at Plattsburgh Barracks, New York, May 15th to August 16th. I immediately dropped out of law school and put in my application. At first, I was unsuccessful, as I was 3 pounds underweight. I was to be given another trial 3 days later, and in the interim visited Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Geller at Bronxville, and under the treatment of Mrs. Geller, who fed me milk and eggs and chased me to bed at 8:30, I gained 5 pounds and passed my next examination, receiving orders to report at Plattsburgh May 14th. The war was too remote to make us truly cognizant of the task before us. Congress, however, acted quickly and authorized an increase in Army organization. Recruiting for the emergency was instituted, the draft law was passed, and the huge sum voted for the prosecution of the war. I left home May 11th, stopping for a few days at Williamstown. It was my first visit since graduation the previous June, but my mind was too occupied with the future to enjoy it. I arrived in Plattsburgh on the morning of the 14th and immediately took my place on a dozen good-natured lines sweating under a hot sun. The whole day was consumed in trying to get a hat that fit, leggings that did not bulge, a shirt that closed at the neck, and an overcoat, 75 degrees in the shade, that would not trail on the ground or flap above the knees. In the light of later experience, I should have taken the first thing handed to me and then exchanged for suitable sizes with men who were also misfits. I carried a bed, mattress, blankets, and a pillow from one barracks to another, looking for a place to settle. I should have waited until some semblance of order was gained, and then modestly, quietly, and unobtrusively walked into the barracks and flopped on the first vacant cot, maintaining what I was taught in my brief stay at law school, that possession is 9/10 of the law, if you're big enough. Reveille was at 5:30 the next morning, and the contemplation of that absorbed all my thoughts. It was horrible to contemplate. Events moved quickly at this stage. The transition from a civilian to a soldier is slow, but the change from civilian clothes to a uniform is exceedingly quick. We all felt proud in the wearing of it, and there was everywhere a spirit of cooperation and service. Caught in the fever of war, we could not contemplate clearly the future. The present held too much of absorbing activity and interest to us. The 1st Plattsburgh Camp. The provisional regiment of 2,400 men each comprised the camp. I was assigned to the 2nd Company, New York. We were housed in wooden barracks, newly completed, each company having its own building. We had sweltering weather, but nevertheless, the company commander's hobby seemed to be hikes, and hiking it was on a hard road all morning. We swung along to the tune of "Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile," and so forth, which was a great favorite. The popular air, "Over There," was introduced later at one of the Saturday evening entertainments by George M. Cohan, its author, and immediately sprang into favor. After a month of doughboy drill, we were given an opportunity to select our branch of the service. I selected artillery, first because it was supposed that an artilleryman rode a horse, and second, I was none too efficient in the use of the bayonet, either naturally or by choice, and third, the guns had a subtle attraction for me. I was assigned to the 1st New York Battery under the Captain Rakoff, and a later better officer I failed to meet anywhere. We had no guns until the end of the period and never fired them, which was just as well, as they were heirlooms of the border service and better fitted for parades. The whole battalion used these 4 guns, and I'm sure they must have become very tired of being taken down and reassembled and listened to the click of their firing pins on dummy cartridges. The troops of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry were stationed at the post, and through them we secured an introduction to a horse. Equitation was 1 hour a day, twice a week, which was plenty for me as a starter. After I had acquired a seat, I was greatly pleased to ride by the tired infantryman after a long hike, who never failed to throw uncomplimentary epithets in my direction. I wonder if he realized that at the journey's end we must clean, feed, and tuck these same horses to bed before we were allowed to think of our own comfort. We didn't at first, but later we thought of nothing else, which tended to dim the glamour of being mounted troops. Here was inculcated in me the basic tradition of the cavalry, that the horse comes first. The efficiency of the troops depended upon the condition of its mount. A soldier who loved his horse, who went hungry and slept sleeplessness so that his horse might be fed, watered, and groomed, could be depended upon as a soldier and a man. A soldier who neglected his horse for his own comfort was irresponsible as a soldier and untrustworthy as a man. Our time after Saturday was much our own, but outside outside attractions were few. I spent one weekend at Lake Placid, the guest of the McCabe's, but my greatest pleasure was to rent a room in town and sink into a real bed one night a week. The family came up at the close of the camp, and I spent my spare time with them. Festivities increased towards the end, as there was a slight let-up in the work. The strain had been very severe, and it was beginning to tell. 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. had a limit as a steady diet. Instruction included close-order drill, map sketches. I was a completely failure in this. Spotting practice, small arms firing, standing gun drill, equitation, and evening classes in blackboard firing, nomenclature of horse and guns and their diseases and cures, company administration, and the ever-present Army regulations and the manuals of court-martial. And when evening classes were over, Alan McDougal, Norm Du Bois, and I regaled ourselves with the pièce de résistance of the camp, shredded wheat, strawberries, and cream at one of the numerous shacks across the road. Opportunity was given to make application for appointment as provisional second lieutenants in the regular Army, and I elected to try, and was accepted. I took this step with the idea that I would see active service more quickly than if I was assigned to a National Army unit, which would be 6 months at least in training. I never regretted my act, for I soon found the rigid discipline of the regular service and the absence of any grandstand effects in perfect accordance with my idea of service in time of war. I was assigned to the 19th Cavalry, together with 25 other officers of similar rank, with orders to report to the CO at Fort Ethan Allen, Vermont, August 29th. I was destined to remain with this regiment during my entire service over a period of 2 years, in which I was extremely fortunate, for there is nothing more detrimental to morale than changing command. The spirit and personnel of the Plattsburgh camp was of the highest order, and it was an inspiration to serve with such men. I saw a great deal of Norm Du Bois, Alan McDougal, and Lambert Wood. Lump was in the infantry, and soon gave evidence of remarkable enthusiasm as a leader. Norm was a tonic to any man with a reveille grouch or a bad case of grumbles. Alan was a horse for work and a genuine enthusiasm. Hurriedly molded into officers as we were, the result accomplished by the camp was better than anticipated, and everyone who secured a commission felt he had earned it, and he had. Camp Ethan Allen. The 19th Cavalry was as new and green as we were, although it had some of old hands to guide it. It was organized in May by transfer from the 2nd Cavalry of officers and men sufficient to form a skeleton regiment. The junior officers were the 27 provisional second lieutenants from Plattsburgh, and the ranks were formed from volunteer enlistments. It was in a real sense a regular Army regiment, with the added advantage of having for its personnel voluntary recruits who had enlisted for the war to serve their country and not as a profession. Training commenced in July on the broad parade grounds of Ethan Allen. We were welcome in one sense and unwelcome in another. They were greatly in need of junior officers, but were chagrined to find that artillery officers, which served to confirm the report that the regiment was to be transferred from cavalry to artillery. I was assigned to B Troop, which together with A Troop formed a provisional Battery A. Lieutenant Wharton G. Ingram was in command. He was destined to be my immediate superior until my promotion in March of 1918, that's November of 1918, and I can't say my service was made easier by reason of serving with him. He possessed a keen mind, a strict sense of duty, and arbitrary manner in dealing with the men, and subsequently proved to be a physical coward. He was heartily and universally disliked, and I was often put in the disagreeable position of having to carry out his unreasonable orders and at the same time maintaining my influence and keeping the respect of the battery. Colonel Guy V. Preston, our commanding officer, was a Tartar on discipline, an old soldier of many and varied experiences which he delighted to recount between puffs of his old corncob pipe. His escapades as a junior officer were known throughout the Army, and his military qualities and abilities as an organizer were exceptional. In November, we were formally converted into the 77th Field Artillery, and on November 3rd, we entrained for an unknown camp in the South. We had hopes for an early assignment overseas, but were doomed to disappointment. The 2 months at Ethan Allen served to acquaint us with and acclimate us to Army life. Our daily officers' classes and equitation were a source of much pleasure and pain, the pain invariably following on the pleasure. I took my 3 spills, and thereafter I was informed that I was a full-fledged cavalryman, although Captain Whiting once ordered me off a single-footer for a real horse. For while they were happy days for most of us, as we were rapidly forming new friendships, and although the uncertainty of the service, a great many of them temporary. Camp Shelby. We arrived in Camp Shelby, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, November 7th, where we put in a miserable 3 weeks on a sandy waste 12 miles from the town. It could have been 1,200 so far as the lure of the town was concerned. From there we departed on Thanksgiving Day for Camp Green, Charlotte, North Carolina, arriving December 1st, and became a member of the 4th Artillery Brigade, 4th Division. The sojourn in Shelby was too brief to make any lasting impression. Paper chases on Saturday afternoons were our only diversion, and most of us packed away our spick-and-span new uniforms and resigned ourselves to our fate. Then the orders came to move. We packed up within 24 hours, bag and baggage. Colonel Preston was proud of the speed and efficiency in which we moved the regiment, but no one else was. We feared someone would counter the order before we got away. It was cold, it was sloppy, and above all, it was muddy that winter at Camp Green. I can still feel the suck of that mud on my boots as we plowed through morning stables. I tented with Lieutenant Albro, and he proved a fine companion, although he did leave my suitcase en route on his leave to Waltham, Massachusetts. His energy was dynamic and contagious. Although outspoken to a fault, he was no hypocrite and proved a true friend on many occasions. There occurred here some change in personnel. Colonel Preston became a brigadier and was assigned to another command. Colonel Comiskey took his place. It was not a change for the better. Colonel Comiskey was an efficient administrator, but not an inspiring leader. Of the original 27 provisional officers who joined at Ethan Allen, but 12 remained, and 6 of us were now acting executive officers of the battery. Parker Tenney of B, Harold Albro of C, Giles Merrill of D, Harold Davis of E, and Herbert Burke of F, and myself of A. Tenney, Davis, and myself eventually rose to command of batteries after the armistice. In the 16th Field Artillery, which was a sister regiment in the brigade, were three of my college friends, Nicola, Arthur, and Marcellus, 1917. I saw little of Charlotte and refrained from any social activities, although the people of the city were kind and hospitable. The work of preparation seemed of such vital importance to me, I thought of nothing else. Here I received my promotion as first lieutenant. Early in April, we departed for a brief 3 weeks in the mountains for firing practice. I fired the first shot of the regiment and presented the shell case to Colonel Preston. Our period here was of great benefit, for we had been stuffed so full of theory by officers that had never fired a gun, or only a dozen rounds a year, that it was a relief to turn our minds to the practical. I was now acting as executive officer of the firing battery, to which position I remained throughout the war. The long-expected orders arrived May 15th, and soon we were on our joyful way to Camp Merritt near New York. Our movements were guarded and supposed to be secret, but regulations were relaxed, so I was able to go home for a few hours. The family also came to Camp Merritt the night before our departure, and the following day, quite unexpectedly, surprised me at the ferry slip at Jersey City in the unmilitary act of superintending the loading of barrack bags. There was no scene that she left us with a smile, although our eyes glistened. Father's last act was to go to give me a sandwich, which I was all the lunch I had that day. It had been hard waiting at Camp Green, especially in the early spring, when reports from France were so discouraging. The strain seemed suddenly to break as the ferry boat moved out of the slip and pointed her nose downstream. All was now expectancy, and a new light was in every eye. At last, we were going over there to demonstrate to our allies, and especially to the Boche, that we were not too proud to fight. The regiment of 1,200 men filled the whole boat to overflowing, like a big family on an outing, and the song of the silent 77th rose and fell through the boat as she splashed her way past Battery Park toward South Brooklyn. I thought, Fritzy, if there are a couple of million more like these as well on their way, you better keep your head down. Hoboken to Chateau Thierry. HMS Hororata was originally built to carry frozen beef between Australia and England, but had been converted into a troop ship at the beginning of the war. The entire 77th Field Artillery was packed in very much like live beef, so it was impossible to make one's way below decks at night. There were numerous rules, regulations, and formations because of the submarine menace. 2 officers were constantly on deck as officers of the day, and, being a junior officer, the second lieutenants had gone on another boat, I drew the midnight to morning watch. This left me to wander about the decks under the stars, with the vast ocean on all sides, and not a light to be seen, although one felt the presence of the other 12 boats of the convoy rushing past in the dark. The thoughts which came over me during those lonely watches I can still recall. It brought me close to my soul, and I felt I was talking to another person, exchanging our deepest thoughts in perfect confidence. 4 officers occupied each stateroom, Lieutenants Albro, McGuire, Bayliss, and myself, so I had plenty of Irish wit and humor to while away the 11 days' trip. we encountered only one storm, which sent everything skidding that was not clamped down, including the piano. Otherwise, the trip was uneventful. We were on English rations, which comprised mostly tea, jam, and curry in every conceivable form. Tea formation was at 5, unless a red dog game interfered. With what joy we welcomed the grey hounds of the England as we neared her shores. These destroyers darted amongst us like dogs before a hunt, chasing in all directions so that the least suspicion of a periscope. Once a submarine appeared and was greeted with a barrage from every gun in the fleet and a few depth bombs to make sure of the job. We steamed into Liverpool May 30th, escorted by several lazy-looking blimps, reminding one of buzzards encircling over their prey, and slumped up on the greasy dock along a very narrow and dirty waterfront. At Liverpool, we marched through the streets with the double purpose of stretching our legs and giving the British an opportunity to look us over. We were met with apathy. The inhabitants had long since lost the thrill that comes with watching marching troops. They had seen too many who never came back. From Liverpool, we entrained for Winchester, and a more beautiful ride I have never made. England appeared like one huge garden, everywhere under care or cultivation, and the hedges and the stone fences, white roads, and gazing sheep passed before us like pages of a picture book. Our stay in Winchester was brief. We found the British rations meager, bread, jam, and meat occasionally. There were some Tommies there whom the government would not trust for overseas duty. We had a little trouble with them over some smuggled whiskey, but it did not amount to an international incident, and I felt on a few store ahead bore witness to our first engagement, the Battle of Mornhill Camp. I ran up to London on a daylight pass and had just time to take to see Westminster Abbey, buy a pair of spurs and a crop, take dinner at the Savoy, and see the show going up. Food was scarce, but the appearance of the people and the city was very free from any signs of a war so nearby, except the large hospitals in front of which the lounged the armless, the legless, the blind, talking it over. The trip from Southampton to Le Havre across the Channel was a bitter cold one, although it was early in June. The deck was our only bedroom, and the man who slept that night, and there was only one, was the one with his back to the funnel. We were cold and stiff in the morning, but the sun shone down our warm welcome to sunny France as we marched from the docks through the streets of Havre to a camp on the hill, beset at every step by street urchins begging for pennies or cigarettes. Here at the camp we could bathe, wash our clothes, and better still, get something to eat that did not originate in an army mess shack. We sat down to dinner at the Continental, the guest of Lieutenant Frederick Montague, who was celebrating the birth of a daughter, and ordered everything on the menu, recognizable or not. After that, we journeyed home to discover near the entrance of the camp one of those delightful little estaminets, or wine shops. There, under the beaming welcome of Madame, who had given her 2 sons to France, and honored by the courtesies of Petite Louise, who timidly gazed at us from the corner, we pledged anew our loyalty to America and our promise to France. We visited a journey from Le Havre to Bordeaux took us through very beautiful country. However, it seemed deserted. All we could see was a few women in the fields pulling weeds, old men pulling ox carts, and at the railroad station, the officials sitting almost languidly and wistfully as we went by, responding only courteously to our greetings. They had watched this scene so many times before, the light hearts going forward and the heavy hearts coming back. But nothing could dampen our spirits. We were on our way. We knew that we were going to be in it, and we knew what the outcome would be. Light-hearted, gay, full of bravado. Our Verdun had not yet come. We echoed our commander's historic phrase, "Lafayette, we are here." This is continued on the other side of this tape. Camp de Sous is a sandy waste 12 miles from Bordeaux. It reminded us of Hattiesburg, except the trees were smaller and the sand deeper. It was ideal for artillery firing, as it was as flat as a table, making good observation from all sides. It had been a French cantonment with all the facilities for our work. We spent 5 feverish weeks here. It was a case of the survival of the fittest. No mercy was shown, and from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. it was a continuous round of classes or firing. Many fell by the wayside. The information was thrust at us, to be swallowed in chunks. Our digestion suffered, as well as our nerves. We received here our materiel and the horses. We immediately became attached to our soixante-quinze, and keen competition and rivalry sprung up between the batteries. A and B always maintained the best rivalry, and they were admittedly the best in the regiment. It was here in a barrage problem that Captain Ingram distinguished himself by firing his guns 5 minutes before the 0 hour and almost lost his military head as a result. The 4th of July, we paraded the streets of Bordeaux, and also on the 14th, the French legal holiday. It was our first parade in full uniform equipment, and we all felt proud and confident, although the clouds at the front were heavy. I had few opportunities to get away from camp routine. One Sunday, I managed to take a trip with Charlie Graham to Arcachon. The 77th Division had preceded us at the Sous by a few weeks, and I was able to renew acquaintances with several of my Plattsburgh comrades, including Alan McDougall. July 28th, we entrained for the front, believing we were to be sent on a quiet sector for breaking in. It was a merry journey, although the band insisted on playing just before the Battle Mother, and we traveled in approved boxcar styles with full equipment, including horses. It was really an inspiring sight to sit on the side of a boxcar, looking down the length of the train and seeing numerous faces and feet hanging out, and hear the rollicking song of the soldiers, seemingly unconcerned with the future and its sufferings. Ours was truly a singing regiment, and in that fact, together with severe discipline, rested salvation. On looking out of my window in the early dawn, 2 days after, I saw a railroad station partially demolished, and I literally spelled out in my astonishment the sign on the platform, studded with shrapnel holes, Chateau Thierry. Only a week before, the German advance had swept through this town, and recoiled before the machine guns of the 3rd Division, and we were going to a quiet sector. Needless to say, this was as far north as our train would take us. Chateau Thierry to the Vale. Major Frederick E. Snyder, who had already won the devotion of the officers and men by his kindly, firm, and gentlemanly administration of the battalion as battalion commander, and myself immediately departed in a truck to locate a regimental echelon in the vicinity of Epierre, about 8 kilometers to the north. We picked out one in a woods just west of the town, and having placed a marker at the crossroads, I awaited the arrival of the regiment. At nightfall, no sign of them appeared, and returning later to the main highway, I ran into Battery B, going forward on another road, and trailing them into Artois Farm, where I found the regiment. Their plans having been changed, they had gone forward without consulting me or notifying me. At Epierre, I saw my first dead German while I was waiting. There were several lying on the woods near the spot, and I was a little bit unhappy to be in their proximity. There might be a live one nearby, and I kept my hand on the Colt just in case I were to meet my first German. My first night under real war conditions was spent in luxury in the light of later events. 3 of us occupied a room on the top floor of an abandoned farmhouse, and in the absence of my bedding roll, I wrapped myself up with Lieutenant Lefferts in his 2 blankets, and we both slept peacefully on the floor. The next night, we pushed forward amidst signs of traffic and innumerable delays to a woods near Ferra and Tardenoir, where we went into a reserve position. Signs of the recent conflict were all about us: abandoned equipment, fresh shell holes, a few unburied Germans, and troops traveling forward. There were evidence of the German preparation for a big drive on Paris in a large scale. Ammunition scattered everywhere, dumps from 2 to 12 feet high, some containing shells of the largest caliber, besides gun emplacements big enough to house the Big Bertha. The next night we pushed on through Ferra and Tardenoir to Mareuil-en-Dole, and here, through poor liaison, our battalion was forced to spend the nights in a thick woods. It was a crucial time. We were within artillery range. Something had gone wrong. Uncertainty and doubt pervaded the atmosphere, and we felt like a ship without a rudder. It was about 9 p.m., August the 5th. We first heard the shine of a hostile shell. I can still hear it. I felt it must be coming straight at me, and I involuntarily stiffened and crouched in my saddle. Those marching on foot ducked awkwardly, and their antics relieved the strain and roused a slight nervous laugh. For the shell landed 100 yards to the flank. We could well learn from our horses' behavior under fire, for they walked on unconcernedly without paying the slightest attention, except when the shell burst fairly close at hand. No one slept much that night, and we waited anxiously for the dawn, half believing that the light would reveal millions of fierce-looking Boche leering at us with vindictive glances from every vantage point. Next morning, we pressed on, forsaking the roads for the more difficult but safer cross-country route. Now we saw our first signs of active combat. We passed huge naval guns and small heavies pounding at the unseen foe from beneath an apple tree or a hedge or under their own camouflaged nets. An airplane darted into view overhead, and we strained our eyes to see the large black iron cross on its wings. Machine guns and anti-aircraft sputtered and cracked from everywhere as this airman darted straight for his objective, a observation balloon, and swooping down, he sent it up in flames, soared high, and straight homeward, unscathed through the flying death. We could not help but admire him. The nerve, courage, and daring will receive its recognition from every true sportsman, no matter whether he be a friend or an enemy. We now struck up a hill among some small firs to camp, but later were told that we were seen, so we moved on to another portion of the woods a little bit to the north. Together with a detail of 20 men armed with picks and shovels, I skirted the woods to find a more suitable gun emplacement. First, we dug a dugout for the captain. That took most of the morning and part of the afternoon, for it must be very deep for him, and he had located it a considerable distance from our battery position. That night was spent in necessary labor preparing the gun positions. This required almost superhuman effort, but we got through just as the morning broke, and we were finally and safely, we thought, located under our camouflage nets for the opening of our firing. 7. Our opening shot, that is the regiment's opening shot, was fired at 7 a.m. August the 7th, Battery C beating us by a few minutes. Lieutenant Albro was now their executive officer, and one had to get up early in the morning to beat him at anything. Firing in this position was very active, as the enemy was making a determined stand along the vale. Our first shelling towards us was very light, and in the midst of it, I stood up to warn a few cannoneers to get down. A shell fragment hit me, very lightly however, on my jacket, and I picked it up and I put it in my pocket. I carried it the rest of the time, and finally it was lost in the breast when we were fumigated before our way home. We had to change our position when we were bracketed, that is a shot and an over, by the enemy, and then no more firing. He was waiting until dark. We were very fortunate that we did, because we pulled out, and that night our battery position where we had been was nothing but pots of shell holes. We fired in this position for about a week, mostly barrage or demolition fire, and at the end of the week or 10 days we were told that we would withdraw for a brief rest. On August 19th we were relieved by the 304th Field Artillery. I remained over 24 hours to familiarize the new executive officer with the position and our barrage line, and at noon rode back with light heart to catch the regiment which had returned to Artois Farm. I took a short cut along an exposed road and matched my wits with a Bosch gun which was searching the road. I almost lost out due to the fact that the stable sergeant had left behind a lame horse, so that I had to put my spurs to him to get him to really move along as we passed over the exposed road. However, we were fortunate, and Bosch was a very poor aimer. We were a happy crew as we marched south and away from the front. We felt like veterans, and our hearts were light. And then, of course, there was a great change. Of course, now we went through the farm country, and we could see the more peaceful part of the French countryside. We would rest at night under the stars and chatting with the feeling of veterans over the eventful days which we had just passed. And then, of course, over an evening meal of fresh eggs, milk, and cheese, which we had been able to purchase at the farms during the day. Roche-sur-Rougon was our destination, and we discovered there a real, true enough swimming hole, and officers and men were soon splashing therein in turn. Here there occurred some change in personnel, and we lost our battalion commander, Major Snyder, as he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. We rested here for several days, enjoying the fact, as I mentioned before, that we were now considered veterans, at least to ourselves. Our expected orders arrived on September 5th, and soon we were on our way again. Rumor had it an all-out drive on Metz, and with high hearts we started out, marching by night, sleeping by day, and mostly in the woods, and otherwise comporting ourselves as though we were on the front and the enemy was expected to appear over the hill the next morning. But we kept on going, and soon we did realize that we were going to be in a new drive because the troops were coming from all directions and marching towards a single objective, which was Saint-Mihiel. We were cautioned on all sides and on all occasions that this was to be a big surprise. It was to the reading public at home, but I can hardly believe that the Germans were not aware of the bursts of preparation going on in this sector. For hours at a time, we were blocked on the road while infantrymen, camions, and artillery shuffled in and out of the long, narrow line going up. There seems to be no priorities of movement, and it was a case of every man for himself and a watch out you don't get caught. September 10th, we arrived at our allotted sector. It was a drizzly, rainy night, and the slimy French mud made our work doubly arduous. We must put our shoulders to the wheel to help the fatigued horses. Men disappeared at the slightest excuse to throw themselves under cover, utterly worn out. The severest test of the regiment is not under fire, but in the long hours of getting ready, for the excitement of danger is not present to help one forget the strain of the unheroic work of moving in. We pushed on, however, not knowing what the next hour would bring forth. Unexpectedly, we turned into a narrow, unimproved road leading around the base of a steep hill, and were told that our destination had been reached. It was hard to realize, as there was not a sign of enemy activity. For 5 hours we waited while F and D batteries, the leading batteries, hauled and swore, drove and shouted, pushed and yelled in a vain endeavor to urge tired horses and hungry men up the steep slope. Dawn broke. We were told to camouflage our guns at once, anywhere and anyhow. We were in the center of an open field, but as we could not go to the woods, we brought the woods to us. We cut branches from the trees in the neighboring woods and threw them over the guns in an irregular line, hoping that we had accomplished some sort of camouflage. But evidently it worked because we had no enemy repercussions as a result of it, and I have reason to believe that the enemy was nowhere near, and if he was, he didn't care. We took our horses and caissons back into the damp, soggy, thick woods crowning the long ridge, but we found no rest for the weary. Ammunition must be hauled, thousands of rounds of it, and all that night until daybreak. Next morning, in desperation, we set out for the guns, tore down our improvised forest, and hauled, shoved, and pushed those guns up the hill. 12 horses to a gun, and every man on the wheel. We got there by a flying start formation conceived by Lieutenant Davis, and additional impelling power furnished in no small measure by the blue-flamed language from the lips of Sergeant Winthrop. We left them there, just under the brow of the hill, facing a line of reserved trenches from which the wondering doughboys cursed us for our exposures and activity. 3,200 rounds of ammunition we must haul to our positions before dawn. All night we worked like ants, building grains by grains the hill of shells. Horses dropped from sheer fatigue. Men disappeared, as before, in the dark to throw themselves exhausted on the ground. Preliminary fire began at midnight, September the 11th. 0 hour was at 5:30, and the ammunition was coming in driblets. Vigilant guards had to watch the precious pile, fearing a raid by a neighboring battery. We had had no rest for 60 hours when we opened up with the preparation fire at midnight. At 5:30 p.m., the surrounding country lit up as if by magic. Every square yard of ground seemed to contain its gun. The horses and the noise and the flames rolled and darted in unbroken sequence. It seemed almost as though the heart would stop in sheer amazement. The rate of fire was fast, too fast, 4 rounds per gun per minute, slowing up periodically to cool the guns, and bursting forward again with renewed vigor. The flames momentarily revealed men running, digging, staggering under the load of shells, all intent on feeding the hungry guns. The sun rose, disclosing 3 lines of guns, hub to hub, stretching as far as the eye could reach, north and south. Fresh life came with the dawn, and hot coffee made us new again. We had had no reply from the Germans. It all seemed unreal, until already down the hill a ragged column of men, unarmed and shuffling in their gait, moved towards us. We eagerly watched their approach. Prisoners, hundreds of them, out of these, cut off by our destructive barrage. I have purposely dwelt on this barrage, for it was in point of artillery engaged and ammunition expended, the most stupendous in our military history, except possibly the one on November the 1st. It was September the 12th, but warm as a midsummer day. Our way led through Neuilly across a no-man's land which had existed for 4 years. We encountered signs of the sudden German exit in the quantity of abandoned personal effects, maps, field glasses, letters, books, and so forth, and finally a kitchen with a mess of potatoes still warm. However tempting they appeared, we dared not touch them for fear of poisoning. We halted near Dommartin and laid on a protective barrage line. There was no firing except by Lieutenant Albro, who had gone forward with infantry with a pirate gun and was amusing himself by firing at an observation balloon miles beyond his range, but a luring target. That night we slept under a full moon. It was a wonderful, peaceful night, and it was hard to realize that 24 hours before the enemy was withdrawing over this ground in the face of our heavy fire. For hours I lay awake, thinking of the great contrast of war and the sudden changes that follow in its trail. The reaction of the previous days set in, and on every hand there was a new spirit of comradeship fostered by mutual dangers suffered and overcome. Victory is sweet. The next day we retraced our steps to Rupt-on-Werve, where we took stock of our horses and equipment. It was a sad inventory, but the success of our efforts compensated us for the loss. The work had been too severe for the soft French horses whose former life had been spent largely pulling a plow through yielding rich soil or hauling the market wagon a few miles to the railroad station. There had been practically no return fire from the enemy during our 3 days here. A lone shell to our left, where our sister regiment, the 16th, was in camp, hit Bill Macilas, one of the Williams men whom I mentioned before. He was instantly killed. Our sojourn in Rupt-on-Werve was short and active. We had only begun to fight now, and rumors of a new drive of vaster proportions spurred us on to clean up and get ready. September the 20th, I was to go forward and locate new positions near Esney on the slope of Hill 308, adjoining La Morte Homme of Verdun fame. I had always been anxious to see this hill, but was not over anxious to visit that night. Anyway, but seeing that my friends at GHQ were so insistent, I started off with several other officers in a bouncing, smelly, springless quad and pulled my tin hat a little further down on my ears. There seemed to be too much exposure at the nape of my neck. Arriving at Montville, our driver pulled off to the side of the road and informed us that he was going no further. So we detrained for the cross-country walk in the direction of the least barbed wire and the biggest shell holes. The road we shunned as a leper. A big shell hole always at hand. It was a very comforting feeling, even though it was half full of stagnant water. An impromptu plunge is often unavoidable when a whistling missile supplies the inspiration. We did not pick out our position. Someone at brigade or division headquarters had been kind enough to do that for us from a map. We merely went to see how lucky or unlucky we had been. Our position had to be approached across a 8-foot trench, so ramps had to be built. For guns do not jump, contrary to the hazy idea of the brigade's operation officer who stuck us here. I often wondered how he missed putting us in the trench. We returned to Whooped-on-Werve with glowing accounts, glowing with profanity, of our new position, and on September 22nd we set out for the sector which was to be our home for 46 consecutive days until the armistice on November 11th. We somehow felt the climax of our service was approaching. It was to be the supreme effort, and we guided ourselves accordingly. Only bare necessities were carried. We were to engage in a war of movement once we had dislodged the enemy from their positions along the so-called Hindenburg Line, which encircled Verdun like a steel band. Sandby Hill had been a surprise party. This, we felt, was going to be a real party. This account is continued on the next Gazette.